Hey boys and girls, I am so glad to be here with you today. I have missed you. I miss your smiling faces. I miss being able to give you a hug. But soon I hope we'll all be able to be together again. But today, Miss Dana asked me if I could come and share a story with you. And I'm excited because I'm going to get to share a couple of stories with you. And the first one I'm going to share is a book that I loved when I was your age. And it's a book that my mom and dad used to read to me. And it has a lot to do with the Bible story that we're going to talk about today, and a lesson that Jesus wants us all to remember. He has two really important things that he wants us to do all the time. He tells us that two of the most important things for us to do is to love him and to love people. And so our story that we're going to read, we're going to learn about two stories today. The first book I'm going to read to you is called The House in the Hole in the Side of the Tree. And it has to do with loving people. So I want to introduce you to my favorite story when I was growing up. We're going to learn about a grumpy character, but hang in there with him because he gets better. "Well, what do you want?" Squire Squirrel growled. He looked so angry that the Chipmunk twins almost ran away. "Well, that is, do you have a hammer that we could borrow?" they answered, almost whispering. "No," shouted Squire Squirrel. "What do you think this is, a hardware store?" Then he slammed the door so hard that the tree shook, and his house in the hole in the side of the tree shook too. Doesn't sound like a pleasant man, pleasant squirrel. Squire mumbled and grumbled all the way up the stairs. He looked around his house to be sure that it was all right. He had not made the house very well. He knew that he must stop slamming doors or the whole house would fall down. "I really should build a better house in a better place," Squire grumbled to himself. "These neighbors never do anything for me. All they ever do is borrow hammers and things." Of course, Squire Squirrel never thought to himself what he did for his neighbors. Just then, Squire heard something at his window. "Yoo-hoo," someone said. Squire opened his window and stared into the face of Oscar Owl, sitting on a limb of a big tree. "Nosy neighbors," Squire mumbled. "They're even sitting in the trees outside my window. What do you want?" "Oscar, what do I want?" Oscar began to think. Yes, what do I want? I seem to have forgotten. I know I was to remember not to forget something, but now I've forgotten what I was supposed to remember not to forget." "I suppose you want to borrow something too," Squire shouted. Why, yes, of course," said Oscar. "How thoughtful of you to remember. But what was I to borrow? Let me think. Oh, yes, I need a steasuring mick. Oh dear, no, I mean a measuring stick." Squire slammed his window so hard that a board fell from his house in the hole in the side of the tree. "And if I had a measuring stick, I'd wrap it around his silly neck," he grumbled. Does Squire sound like a very nice squirrel? No. Squire had just slammed the window shut when he heard someone knocking on the door downstairs. When he opened it, there were his next tree neighbors, smiling and looking like very happy squirrels. "Do you have a saw that we could borrow?" they started to say, but Squire slammed the door without bothering to answer. Well, that night, Squire lay in his bed for a long time, looking up at the big moon over his next tree neighbor's tree. He felt very lonely, and he felt very sad. Squire knew that he really wanted some friends, but he knew that he would never have any friends by slamming doors and windows and shouting when they tried to be friendly. With these thoughts running through his mind, Squire fell asleep. He doesn't have very many friends because he's not very kind to his neighbors. While he slept, Squire dreamed that a hammer and a saw were chasing him. He ran to each neighbor's house to ask for help, but each time he tried to talk, someone slammed a door or a window. At last, the hammer and saw chased him all the way home. As he locked himself in his house, Squire felt more lonely and sad than he had ever felt. Then he sat down and he cried. But there was no friend to help him feel better. Well, the next morning, Squire woke up suddenly. It's going to get better. Someone was knocking on his door, and he ran down the steps and he opened the door. Squire almost expected to see that big hammer and saw standing there ready to chase him again, but instead, he saw all his neighbors laughing and looking very happy. They're looking happy even though he hasn't been very kind to him. Squire started to ask, "Well, what do you want?" But he didn't. Then he started to slam the door, but he didn't. He kept thinking about his dream, and he knew how it felt to have someone slam a door when you come to see him. Squire was happy that a hammer and a saw were not chasing him now. He was very happy that his neighbors were not slamming doors, and he was very, very happy that they had come to see him. "Oh, will you come in?" Squire asked. "Will you have breakfast with me?" Later, they all shouted cheerfully, "Come with us. We have a surprise for you." Then Squire's neighbors took him to a big tree, not very far away. In the side of the big tree, there was a big hole. And in the big hole was a beautiful new house. "It's your new house," they all shouted. "We made it for you because we like you and we want to be your friends." Well, Squire Squirrel, he felt so ashamed that he couldn't even look at his beautiful neighbors. While he had been shouting at them and slamming doors and windows, they had been making a house for him. "I'm so sorry I've been so grumpy," he said. "I'll never slam a door or window again when you come to see me." "Well, dear me," said Oscar the Owl, "I seem to have forgotten to remember that you slam doors and windows." The Chipmunk twins began to laugh. Then the next tree neighbors, who weren't next tree neighbors anymore, began to laugh too. Even Squire Squirrel began to laugh. Then all the friends went inside to look at Squire's new house in the hole in the side of the tree. Well, when I was growing up, this was one of my favorite books. My mom and dad used to read that story to me. But today, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one of my other favorite stories. But this story, you can tell that this story is just a made-up story because we know squirrels don't talk. But the story I'm going to share with you now, we know, is not a made-up story. It's a true story. And we know it's true because it comes from the Bible. And we know that every story that we hear in the Bible, that Pastor Melvin shares with us, that Pastor Keith shares with us, that Pastor Taylor, that Miss Dana, or our Sunday school teachers, or our moms and dads, or our aunts and uncles, or our grandparents, whoever takes good care of us at home, when they share those with us, we know that those stories are true stories. They're real stories. They're not like the book I just read to you. They're real stories because those stories are shared with us about Jesus, about God, and they're stories that we can keep in our heart. We can learn from those, and we can carry them with us. And so the story I want to share with you now is a story that Jesus used to teach some people who were actually trying to trick him a little bit. They wanted to see if they could trick Jesus, but he wasn't going to be tricked. And this story, sometimes we'll tell you where things live in the Bible. That's how we share them with you. And this story lives in Luke in the Bible. That's kind of near the back of your Bible. In the New Testament, our Bible's divided into like the Old Testament and the New Testament. So this story lives in Luke in the New Testament. And it's the story of the Good Samaritan. And I kind of like to read this story to you sometimes, and you might have heard it. We've shared that story some in our Sunday school class, but it reminds me of the Good Samaritan. Well, there were some people, like I shared with you, and they wanted to try to trick Jesus because they didn't really like Jesus, and they didn't believe some of the things that he shared with them. And so they asked him, they wanted to know, they knew the law really good. They knew the rules, and they asked him, they said, what do we need to do to get into, to live a perfect life, to live just the right life? And he told them what they needed to do. He said, you need to follow the commandments that God has given us, and you need to love God, and you need to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So that's when we say it's really important to love God and to love people. But then they said, well, who is our neighbor? And he said, well, let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story. He used things called parables, which are stories, to often explain things to people so they could understand them. And so he told them this story. He said, there was a man walking on a country road, and robbers attacked this man, and they beat him terribly, and they stole everything he had. Well, a teacher of God's law saw the man lying in the road. But guess what he did? He just passed right by him. He didn't stop to help him. Another religious man came along, but guess what he did? He looked the other way. Finally, a man from Samaria, a Samaritan, came along, and he saw the injured man in the road, lying there. But guess what he did? He hurried over to help the man. And it just so happened that the man that was injured, Samaritans and this man that was injured, they didn't usually get along. But the Samaritan, he didn't let that stop him. Because you know what he did? He knew that he was supposed to stop and love people and help people. So that's what he did. He stopped and he cared for the man right there. He took care of as many of his hurts that he could, and he put him on his donkey, his animal, and he took him to an inn nearby, which is kind of like our hotels and motels now, and he with his very own money, with what he had, he told the innkeeper, he said, now, I want you to take care of this man, and if what I've given you right now, if it doesn't cover what you need, I'll be back, and I will pay for whatever you need to take care of him until he's better. And so Jesus then asked the people that were trying to trick him, he said, which one of those men did the right thing? Which one of those did what was right? And they said, well, it would be the one who helped him. And he said, that's right, and that's what you should do. So I just want you to try to remember, we have a lot of time right now where we've been at home a lot, and we have people in our own family. Hopefully you have neighbors nearby. Some of you might not have as many close neighbors, but we are getting out a little bit more now, or you might go through a drive-through, or you might go to the grocery store sometimes with your mom or your dad or your family that takes care of you. But we have a lot of chances and opportunities right now that we can love on other people. And maybe this week you'll be able to remember Squire Squirrel, or you'll be able to remember the Good Samaritan, and you'll remember that God has told us to love Him and to love people. And we can do that. We can do that in our own home, and we can do it when we go out and about. But I love you, and I miss you, and I hope that I'll get to see you really soon. And thanks for spending some time with me today.